Taking a look at all the very latest, now it's the ITV Lunchtime News.
A small window of hope opens for civilians fleeing the fighting in Ukraine, but will it last? Russia says it will cease fire for 12 hours in limited areas it has bombarded in Ukraine, but will it hold, and how many will make it out? But in the city of Mariupol, the Red Cross say the situation is apocalyptic.
You have to divide between each other what is available. There is humanitarian aid, but it cannot be delivered now.
Some news breaking this lunchtime. Ukraine warned that power had been cut to the Chernobyl nuclear plant, raising concerns about radioactive leaks. No end to the exodus of Western companies from Russia as Mothercare, KFC and Heineken join others in pulling out. Also on the programme, concern from the Children's Commissioner as 1.8 million children missed school during the pandemic. And perfectly preserved, one of the world's most famous shipwrecks, Endurance, is found more than a century after it sank.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Rageh Omaar.
Hello. The desperate attempts by Ukrainian civilians to leave cities shattered by Russian bombardment continues while some humanitarian corridors remain open. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister says a 12-hour ceasefire has been agreed in 6 of the worst affected areas. Aid workers and eyewitnesses say the situation in some areas are horrific, with families and young children trapped in basements with little water and freezing conditions. With the latest, here's Ellie Pitt.
Mariupol. A city cut off from water, food and medical supplies for days now. They are surrounded by Russian troops and surviving with what little they have left. We're collecting water from roofs after it rains, this aid worker explains. And there is torment for residents who know help is on the other side of the invading forces. You have to divide between each other what is available. There is humanitarian aid, but it cannot be delivered now, this woman says. Humanitarian corridors have opened, but not soon enough for everyone. Tatiana Perebenos was trying to escape Irpin, north of Kyiv, during what was supposed to be a ceasefire. She was with her 2 children, her 18-year-old son Nikita and her daughter Elise, who was just 9. ITV News has spoken to a friend of the family.
This is just heartbreaking. We just can't accept it. We cannot forgive it. And there are no words to describe the pain.
After efforts to get thousands out of Sumy through a humanitarian corridor yesterday, there is hope more will be able to escape this way from other towns and cities today. On the outskirts of Kyiv, others are trying to flee too. Even the most vulnerable now see the challenge of leaving outweighs the risk of staying. In Mykolaiv, this hospital is busy with those injured by relentless Russian attacks, while a medical center itself was the victim of bombing in Kharkiv. As the assault on cities across Ukraine continues, the West's response is tightening. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked his American counterpart for banning the import of Russian oil. This video from the Russian Defense Ministry claims to show that their tanks, bearing the Soviet Union flag, continue to advance. But British intelligence suggests they are failing to break through near the capital. And Kyiv's resolve rang out this morning. The silence of the capital's empty streets filled with the defiance of the country's national anthem. Ellie Pitt, ITV News.
Well, Ukraine's state-run nuclear power company has raised concerns this morning about radiation at the Chernobyl plant. Our Europe editor, James Mates, is in Kiev. And James, what more can you tell us about that and also about the humanitarian corridors as well?
Yeah, well, they have raised this issue that Chernobyl, the plant there, where of course three of the 4 reactors continue to operate, which has now been occupied by the Russians for several days. They say it's now cut off from the main electricity grid, and the concern there is that that will prevent the pumps that operate the cooling water around spent fuel rods from keeping them cool. Now, and this is obviously a matter of massive concern. The International Atomic Energy Authority would dearly love to be back in Chernobyl to see what is going on, but while they have said that they've lost contact with the Chernobyl monitoring systems, but the last reading there was no worrying signs of radiation. But they also said just 5 or 6 days ago that due to the time elapsed since the Chernobyl accident, the heat load on the spent fuel storage pool and the volume of cooling water is such to maintain effective heat removal without the need for electrical supply. So while obviously there's concern, the potential for some sort of nuclear disaster or nuclear release of nuclear material is probably not imminent. In terms of the humanitarian corridor and the situation on the battlefield, is going to get very, very difficult because of the weather here. You can see the snow is just coming in. The temperatures are going to drop to between -10 and -20 tomorrow, we're told. Make life incredibly difficult for anyone living without heating, but also for the armies in the field as well.
James in Kiev, thank you so much. Well, the US has rejected an offer from Poland to send all of its MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. Our US correspondent Emma Murphy joins me. Emma, this has caused quite consternation, hasn't it, amongst some in Congress. What's the latest on this from the Pentagon?
Yeah, and it seems to have been one of those rows that's been rumbling on for absolutely days now. Congress were pushing that the NATO and the Americans accepted these MiG fighter jets from Poland because it was a way to kind of get around that whole issue of the no-fly zone that President Zelensky has been asking for so many days. But last night, there was this incredible development where Poland basically said, we're sending this fleet of MiGs, we're sending them to the US NATO base in Germany, and they'll be there ready for Ukraine to take into Ukrainian skies. There was huge alarm here. The Pentagon putting out a late night statement saying, absolutely not, that is not a tenable solution, because basically what that would do would mean that planes flying under the NATO auspices to a certain extent, leaving from a German base, were going to be directly facing off against Russian planes over Ukraine. And that was seen as something that just was not going to be acceptable and risked really seriously heightening the tensions in this already very tense situation. So at the moment, there's a bit of a standoff. Poland hasn't sent those jets yet. The US say they don't want them. They're trying to find an in-between. I'm heading off to a press conference shortly with the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and Liz Truss, the UK Foreign Secretary. I expect that will be very high on the list of questions, along with the issue of Chernobyl.
I'm sure it will. Thank you very much indeed, Emma. Now, the human cost of this conflict is rising every day. The UN says 470 civilians have died so far. 38 of them are children caught up in the conflict. Before the ceasefire in Sumy allowed some to escape, a 16-year-old wrestling champion, Artem Priamenko, was killed alongside his parents, siblings and grandparents by bombs battering residential homes. For anyone still trying to escape from the war in Ukraine, the situation is becoming ever more desperate. For days now, in the southern port city of Mariupol, there has been no electricity, no heating, food or water. It's believed 500,000 civilians remain in the city. The International Committee of the Red Cross described the situation as apocalyptic. Crystal Wells from the charity joins me now from Geneva. What more can you tell us about the situation in Mariupol and wider?
That the situation in Mariupol is becoming increasingly dire and desperate. You're right. The word apocalyptic was a word that was actually shared with me by our team in Ukraine to describe the situation there. And it's because people really are living without nothing. No food, no water, no heat as it's freezing temperatures, no electricity, and lives, quite simply, are on the line if they don't receive humanitarian assistance soon. We, as the ICRC, we have a team in Mariupol, and our ability to respond to these needs has has increasingly become more and more difficult. So, for example, last week, we were able to give some items like food and water and relief items to about 4,000 people living in shelters. We gave out what medical supplies we had to hospitals, but for our teams too, the supplies are really running out, and we urgently need humanitarian assistance to get into the city, and civilians need to have safe passage to get out of the city if they choose to leave.
Well, on both those points, is the problem of getting humanitarian aid that it is being blocked or frustrated, and if so, by whom? And then second to that is, what more can you tell us about these so-called humanitarian corridors? We've had ceasefires in the past, they've broken down, civilians have been caught in the shelling. So who's blocking you, and what about the civilians?
So in terms of the humanitarian corridors and basically where we stand is more or less where it was for, at least for us as of Sunday. Our team was ready to help open up the route to get out of the city, and fighting resumed. And it was clear that there was no safe option for our teams or civilians out of the city. So just as it's the case that it's very difficult to get people out of the city safely, it's very difficult to get aid into the city safely. So again, we urgently need aid to get into the city, and we need for those civilians who want to leave to be able to leave. And I want to underscore, there's a lot of talk about so-called humanitarian corridors, and those are one way to get those out who choose to leave. But actually, under international humanitarian law, which is the law that governs armed conflict, parties to the conflict actually have an obligation to allow civilians to leave, to allow ways for safe passage for civilians, and civilians actually have a right to receive humanitarian assistance. So it is incredibly important that we're able to deliver assistance to the people in cities like Mariupol today.
Okay, Crystal Wells of the ICRC in Geneva, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Now, in response to the conflict in Ukraine, some of the world's consumer giants are pulling out of Russia in droves. Overnight, Mothercare, Heineken and KFC join McDonald's and others in ceasing trading. Our business editor, Joel Hill, joins me now. This is a massive exodus of ordinary, massive brands. But, I mean, it's just another indicator of the collapse of the Russian economy.
I think what's interesting here, Rageh, you're absolutely right. The Russian economy is getting hammered by Western sanctions. What we've seen here, though, is a series of names, and the Russian state can certainly influence what ordinary Russians are seeing about what's happening in the Ukraine. It cannot influence, really, what they can see with their own eyes in their own country. So last week we had IKEA, we had H&M, we had Ford, all saying they're going to stop or their operations there. Yesterday, a big day, McDonald's, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, all said that they were withdrawing their operations too. McDonald's was one of the very first multinationals to go into Russia in January 1990. It started, set up shop there. It's now part, as you say, of an exodus. A trickle has become a flood. Now, there are good reasons to stop doing business in Russia on a practical sense. Sanctions make it harder to get things in and out of Russia. If you trade there in rubles, then you're probably deeply loss-making because the currency has collapsed in value. There's also reputational damage elsewhere. If you continue to do business, you may well lose sales in parts of the world who see this as a completely unjustified and appalling conflict. There's political pressure too. Grant Shapps, the transport minister, said this morning that any multinational that continues to do business in Russia is almost certainly providing blood money to funding Putin's war machine. Mars, Mondelez, Papa John's, Hilton, Accor, Marriott, they're all still there. They argue, Rageh, that they're doing the humanitarian thing. Uniqlo says it's keeping its shops open because clothing is a necessity of life. Nestle says it's providing a reliable supply of safe and essential food for ordinary Russians.
The pressure really growing on all those brands. Thank you very much indeed, Joel. Still to come. Undiscovered for 107 years, Shackleton's lost ship is finally found. Questions for the Prime Minister today about the growing refugee crisis in Ukraine and the problems with setting up visa application centres. Our political correspondent Shihab Khan is in Westminster. Shihab, the government's come under huge pressure on this, to say the very least. What did the Prime Minister say in Parliament today?
Yeah, so he was questioned on it at Prime Minister's questions, but before that, the Ukrainian ambassador was actually here in Parliament where he faced questions from MPs and discussed it in detail as well. He said that it's been a difficult process to get visas from even before the invasion actually started, noting that despite being the ambassador, that his wife found it difficult to get a visa. When talking to MPs, he said it would be better if we could simplify the process, especially when the situation is so severe. Now, at the moment, less than 1,000 visas have been issued to Ukrainian refugees. That was something that was highlighted and put to the Prime Minister during Prime Minister's questions today.
Does the Prime Minister find it acceptable that his Home Secretary has overseen one of the slowest, most bureaucratic and incompetent refugee responses in the whole of Europe?
The numbers are almost 1,000 as I speak to him today, and we expect those numbers to rise to in the region of the hundreds of thousands.
Now, the latest update on that is that a visa processing centre is set to start taking appointments in Lille from tomorrow. At the moment, you can only come to the UK if you're a refugee, if you've got family who is already here. There is a second scheme that we've heard a lot about. It was mentioned by the Prime Minister. It's called the sponsorship scheme. The details of that will be explained in the coming days. At the moment, with the targets being set, with the Prime Minister saying he wants to see it to go from thousands to the hundreds of thousands, it's unclear how efficiently and how quickly that can be done.
Thank you very much indeed, Shihab. Now, away from Ukraine and here, there is concern from the Children's Commissioner about the numbers of children missing school. Almost 1.8 million children miss school, at least 10% of school in the autumn term in England. The number of children missing at least half of school is also greater than previously thought at 122,000. The Children's Commissioner, Rachel de Souza, joins me. How concerned are you by these pretty staggering figures?
Yeah, I'm concerned, and these estimates are very concerning. So as we came out of lockdown, I did a survey of England's children, and over 500,000 of them told me how important it was for them to be in school and how important their education was. And that's why I've made it my mission to really understand why a large number of them haven't come back to school. Why a number of them haven't come back to school and where they are. I've surveyed 151 local authorities, and those estimates have come from that survey and those local authorities, and we are really concerned about that.
Sorry about that, in cutting across you. So, I mean, is this being taken notice of in government? I mean, are they aware? And if so, I mean, what more can be done to make sure that, given the situation is still continuing, more of this doesn't happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So everybody is aware, and I would say every teacher I've spoken to, right up to the Secretary of State for Education, are really keen to fix this issue. So what's the problem? So we need to know. We need to have live data about where children are. At the moment, the local authorities that we spoke to couldn't tell us exactly, how many children they had in their areas that were not on any roll, and only 50% of them could estimate how many were missing school. There are some really simple things we can do. We can have a unique identifier to actually, so that the NHS, the police, schools, all identify children with just one number rather than lots of different ones. So when any of us come across a child, we know we can make sure that we can get them into school and we're talking about the same child. And everyone needs to make attendance their own business. We need to really get the systems working better and get children back into school.
Very briefly, I mean, there'll be a lot of parents concerned, saying what can be done to make sure that children do catch up on all this schooling that they've lost. Just very briefly.
Yeah, so I mean, I think schools are working really, really hard on that. Number one, let's get children into school. If they're not in school, then they can't catch up. Lots of schools are putting on extra lessons. We've really got a lot of expertise in this, but we need to look carefully at the other barriers too. Some of the reasons children are telling us they're not in school are because of their mental health or concerns because they've got special educational needs not been met. Some have just been truant. So schools need to work on all those areas as well as on the academics. And I think we can do it. The numbers are improving. This week is a lot better than this time a month ago, and we just need to keep going. I mean, and we need to look under the numbers at children's lives. I mean, 1 in 4 children with a social worker were not in school last week, and we really need to get them in
Thank you to Rachel D'Souza. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, next, 3,000 metres below the Antarctic ice, where it was crushed more than a century ago, one of the world's most famous shipwrecks has been found. Ernest Shackleton's ship Endurance sank in 1915, forcing all men on board to make an astonishing escape. Historian Dan Snow joined the expedition to search for the wreck. He spoke to James Dunham about the moment the team realised they'd found it.
Beautifully preserved, the word endurance still boldly on display. This discovery, as remarkable as her state, 107 years after she sank.
The condition of the ship was better than we could have dreamed. So it's below zero. And in that environment, there are no microorganisms that can live down there and feed on wood like you get in the rest of the world's oceans. It's also, there's no wood in Antarctica because they haven't evolved to feed on wood down there. And that means the wreck is almost perfectly preserved. It looks much as it looked on the 21st of November 1915 when it sank.
Ice was Endurance's enemy after becoming stuck in the Weddell Sea. Ernest Shackleton and his 27 crew remained on board for 10 months before abandoning ship. Miraculously, all survived. Until now, finding the wreck has appeared impossible, and at times this expedition has been challenged by the blizzard conditions. Remotely operated submarines and laser technology has been crucial. Endurance discovered exactly 100 years after Shackleton was buried.
They've never been deployed in this way before, in this picture of water, to this depth, tethered in the way that they were with a fibre optic cable under sea ice. And it is just so exciting to think over the next years what other treasures we might discover both on the seabed or buried beneath the sands of the Egyptian desert.
Endurance will remain as she is, untouched and untempered. A centuries-old maritime mystery finally solved. James Dunham, ITV News.
Amazing find. Finally, a group of Ukrainian ballet dancers who were on tour in France when war broke out have been offered a place to perform. The 30 young dancers gave an emotional performance to a full house in Paris. It was the last show of their French tour that has left them stranded. Many have families still in Ukraine. That's it for this lunchtime. Mary will be here with the evening news at 6:30 with much more on the ongoing Ukraine crisis. The news where you are follows the national weather. But from me and everybody, bye-bye.